Welcome to this explainer, where today we are diving into a story of absolute, mind-boggling tactical disaster. We're zeroing in on one single, fateful morning in the year 1119, a morning that literally rewrote the balance of power in the Middle East. See, for 20 whole years after the First Crusade, the Frankish armies had built up this incredible aura. People thought they were militarily invincible. But today, we're going to examine the exact moment that myth was completely, violently shattered in a dusty, rocky valley in Syria. This is the Battle of Ager Sanguinis, the Field of Blood. The battle that broke Antioch, ended an era of unchecked expansion, and dragged the region into a brutal new reality of warfare.
So, I really want to start by throwing this question out to you. Did one single, incredibly arrogant decision by a Norman prince single-handedly doom an entire army? I mean, a decision so bad that the death toll gave Assyrian Valley the terrifying name, the Field of Blood. The sheer scale of the hubris we're looking at today is, well, it's truly mind-blowing. As we peel back the layers of this catastrophic defeat, I think you'll see that history doesn't always turn on these grand, inevitable acts of fate. Sometimes it all just comes down to the fatal, very human flaws of the people calling the shots.
To understand how this happened, we need to look at the two rival heavyweights in this high-stakes struggle for the crucial city of Aleppo. In one corner, you've got Roger of Salerno, the regent prince of Antioch. Roger was a highly ambitious, seasoned Norman commander, and he was known for being aggressive. Relentless expansionist tactics were his whole playbook. And standing against him in the other corner is Ilghazi of Mardin, the Archakid ruler of Aleppo. Ilghazi was this brilliant, opportunistic Turkmen warlord who actually managed to pull off what so many others had failed to do. He took the notoriously fractured Muslim forces of the region, pulled in troops from as far away as Damascus, and essentially forged them into a single, terrifying nomadic alliance.
Now, to see how these two collided, we actually have to rewind 5 years earlier, to 1114. A massive earthquake violently shook the region, completely devastating the heavy stone defensive fortifications of the Crusader states. Knowing his borders were exposed, Roger of Salerno faced a choice. Instead of hunkering down and rebuilding, he took this vulnerability as a green light to just go on the offensive. By 1115, he's pushing aggressively into the borderlands, capturing key fortresses, and basically choking the life out of Aleppo's vital trade routes. But there was a massive unintended consequence to all this pressure. It terrified the citizens of Aleppo so deeply that by 1118, they willingly threw their city gates open to Ilghazi, desperately begging for his protection. By constantly pushing, Roger inadvertently forced his divided Muslim rivals to unite right on his doorstep.
This brings us to the fatal tactical blunder. Driven by some serious overconfidence, Roger completely ignored the frantic pleas of his own advisors. When Ilghazi crossed the Euphrates with a massive force in June 1119, the Patriarch of Antioch literally begged Roger to just stay behind his walls. The plan was simple: wait for the heavy reinforcements that were actively marching north under King Baldwin II of Jerusalem. But Roger? He flat out refused. Riding high on a victory he'd won 4 years earlier using rapid strikes, he decided to advance his army entirely alone. And worse than that, he marched his men straight into a geographic nightmare. He set up camp in this narrow, highly enclosed, heavily wooded valley near Sarmata. It was essentially a claustrophobic killbox where his heavy cavalry had absolutely zero room to maneuver.
40,000. Take a second to process that number. That is the massive tidal wave of highly mobile Seljuk and Turkmen warriors that historical sources estimate were bearing down on the Crusaders. Now sure, medieval numbers can sometimes be slightly exaggerated by chroniclers, but the terrifying reality here was undeniable. A sweeping ocean of nomadic fighters was advancing on a tiny fraction of that number. The Crusaders were so entirely outmatched in sheer manpower that engaging in an open-field battle without King Baldwin's reinforcements wasn't just risky, it was tantamount to military suicide.
But Ilghazi didn't just rely on having more guys. He executed an absolute masterclass in psychological warfare and battlefield intelligence. Get this. His scouts actually infiltrated the Crusader camp disguised as local merchants. They walked right in, meticulously counted the tents, checked the provisions, and mapped out Roger's exact defensive positions. Armed with this vital intel, Ilghazi split his enormous forces under the cover of darkness, and they silently scaled the rugged ridges of the surrounding Harim Mountains. Imagine waking up on the morning of June 28th, looking up and finding the steep, wooded hillsides completely swarming with enemies who had mapped your every move while you slept. The Crusaders were trapped in a temporary stockade, no sustainable food or water, suffocating in a valley they couldn't escape.
Looking closely at this breakdown, you can clearly see this wasn't just a catastrophic mismatch in raw numbers. It was a fundamental mismatch in the very nature of how these two sides fought. Roger commanded roughly 700 elite, heavily armored Norman knights, a few hundred Armenian light cavalry known as Turcopoles, and maybe 3,000 footmen. Waiting for them were tens of thousands of light, highly mobile horse archers armed with devastating composite recurve bows. Here's the thing. Frankish military doctrine relied entirely on the explosive, thundering impact of a heavy cavalry charge to break enemy lines. But when you're trapped in a confined rocky valley, surrounded by enemies who can just continuously shoot, retreat, and reposition, that single tactical advantage is completely 100% neutralized.
So realizing they were completely encircled as the sun rose, Roger boldly, or honestly maybe madly, declared to his men that he was going hunting. He desperately organized his trapped forces into a series of tactical units and ordered an uphill charge out of the valley. And crazily enough, for a fleeting moment, the terrifying kinetic impact of that heavy cavalry actually worked. The armored knights on the right flank violently smashed into the enemy lines, their lances causing genuine panic and physically driving back the initial waves of the Turkish vanguard. But the optimism didn't last. Ilghazi's forces were like water. Every time the Frankish knights blew a hole in the line, massive, seemingly endless reserves of Muslim reinforcements just poured right in to quickly plug the gaps. The tremendous momentum of the Crusader charge simply bled out against a wall of fresh troops.
And then the momentum violently shifts. The absolute breaking point happened in the chaos of the left flank. The light Turcopole cavalry who were supposed to protect the exposed side of the Crusader charge were suddenly overwhelmed by the sheer, darkening storm of arrows. Unable to close the distance, they broke formation. In their blind panic to escape the slaughter, they turned their horses and bolted. And as they routed, they crashed directly into Roger's own foot soldiers right in the center of the valley. They were physically trampling their allies, completely shattering the tightly packed Frankish infantry formation. In a matter of minutes, disciplined battle lines completely dissolved into absolute bloody chaos.
Just as the Frankish lines were collapsing, it was like nature itself decided to join the fight against them. A terrifying meteorological phenomenon known as the Khamsin struck the valley. This is a sudden, violent, dry north wind, and it whipped across the parched earth, kicking up a blinding, choking wall of intense yellow dust and sand directly into the faces of the Christian soldiers. They couldn't see their commanders. They could barely breathe. They were utterly disoriented. And for the Turkish horse archers, it provided the perfect, impenetrable cover to close in for the final gruesome slaughter.
With his army entirely collapsing around him in this blinding storm of sand and arrows, Roger of Salerno made a desperate final stand at the center of the camp. He rallied his remaining men at the foot of their holiest relic, a great jeweled fragment of the true cross. But the defense was totally futile. During this brutal, swirling hand-to-hand combat, a Turkish soldier broke right through the guard and struck Roger directly through the face with a sword, piercing his brain and ending his life instantly. The head of the snake was severed, and the Antioch command structure simply evaporated in a matter of seconds.
The very moment Roger fell, the holy standard was captured, and what was left of the army descended into an unrecoverable panic. This quote right here, from the primary historical sources, captures it perfectly. It describes the pure, absolute annihilation of the Antioch army trapped in that valley. It wasn't a battle anymore, it was a total massacre. Almost every single knight was killed right there in the dirt. Only a tiny handful of men managed to slip away to a nearby tower, and even they were dragged out and captured shortly after.
So that brings us to Section 1, the Field of Blood, Annihilation, and Historical Aftermath. The fighting was over, but the true horror of this event was honestly just beginning.
The extreme casualties on the battlefield itself were horrifying enough, but what happened next truly sealed the dark legacy of this day. Ilghazi ordered his men to meticulously hunt down every last survivor. Frankish knights and servants who had thrown down their weapons to surrender or who had fled in terror were dragged into the local vineyards and mercilessly slaughtered. It was the brutal, systematic eradication of an entire generation of Norman knights. This unfathomable level of bloodshed is what permanently gave the site its terrifying Latin name, Ager Sanguinis, which literally translates to the Field of Blood.
In the immediate aftermath, this really stark contrast emerged. For the victors, Ilghazi gained massive political and religious prestige. He was hailed as a star of religion, parading captured knights through the streets of Aleppo before having them executed. He successfully halted Crusader expansion dead in its tracks. But here's the catch. He actually failed to fully capitalize on it. His army of nomadic horsemen completely lacked the heavy siege equipment required to breach the imposing walls of Antioch itself, and honestly, a lot of his troops just wanted to take their vast plunder and head home. Meanwhile, the defeated city of Antioch was sitting there completely defenseless. Its noble houses were entirely wiped out on the battlefield. The lords were dead, leaving behind a terrified city composed largely of widows. With Antioch totally exposed, survival for the Crusader states suddenly came down to just one man, King Baldwin II of Jerusalem. Hearing about the catastrophe, he didn't hesitate for a second. He immediately force-marched his army north at a blistering pace. He acted incredibly decisively, confronting Ilghazi later that summer at the Battle of Hob, which effectively stabilized the bleeding border and pushed the Turkish forces back. But you know what his most brilliant pragmatic move was? It was purely political. To secure defenseless Antioch, he took on the role of regent and quickly married off those wealthy Norman widows to his own loyal knights. Just like that, he instantly repopulated the nobility and restored the military backbone of the entire fiefdom.
The reverberations of this single bloody morning completely rewrote the geopolitical map of the Middle East. First, it shattered that long-held psychological myth of Frankish military invincibility, proving to everyone they could be utterly destroyed in the field. It permanently ended the independent, aggressive era of Antioch. From then on, they were forced into a defensive posture, relying entirely on the Kingdom of Jerusalem just to survive. For the Islamic world, this was a massive proof of concept, proving that unified, highly mobile Muslim armies could absolutely crush a Crusader state. And for the Christians, this terrifying exposed vulnerability made it crystal clear that standing armies were needed to protect the Holy Land, which directly accelerated the formal recognition and rise of armed religious groups. Most notably, this paved the way for the birth of the legendary Knights Templar.
So I want to leave you with this final lingering thought. What if? What if Roger of Salerno had just listened to his advisors, swallowed his pride, and waited a few more days for King Baldwin's heavy reinforcements to arrive? The massacre at the Field of Blood might never have happened. Antioch might have continued its expansion, and the fragile balance of power in the region could have shifted entirely. It is a haunting reminder that history so often hinges not on grand, inevitable designs, but on one person's fatal hubris. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer and diving into the past with us today.